There is a thing every great house keeps that the family does not speak of, and it is not the silver, nor the paintings, nor the name carved over the door. It is the keys. Every old house in England has a ring of them, iron and brass worn smooth by 100 years of hands, and that ring is the truer deed to the place. A man may own a house on paper. The keys say who holds it. They open the still room, and the linen presses, the cellars, and the cold larder, and the locked cabinet where the good wax candles are kept. And the woman who carries them at her waist is the one the house answers to. You may give a woman the name of a house, and the seat at its table, and the ring upon her finger, and she will be a stranger in it still, until the day the keys are put into her hand. They are given, when they are given, without ceremony. An old mistress lays them in the palm of the new one, and the house changes hands as quietly as that, and nothing is said, because the whole of it has been said already by the giving. That is why the county spoke for years after of one winter night at Cottermere, and could never agree on what it was they had seen. The Duke of Aldermore, who had not taken his place at the head of his own table in the memory of most who served him, rose that night and lifted his glass and said, "A toast to Lady Ashcroft." And far down the table his Duchess, who had never once been given the keys of the house she was mistress of, took up the great iron ring from where it had lain all the evening and set it down gently beside another woman's plate. No one who watched it understood it. It would be a long while yet before anyone did. Linnet Marrow had been little more than a child when the world first taught her what it was made of, and it had gone on teaching her the same hard lesson in the years since. Her father had been a respected man once. Long before she was grown, he had become a byword instead, and the daughter of a byword, in the arithmetic of the world, comes to much the same thing as being no one's daughter at all. Her father had been Mr. Stockton Marrow of Aldous Street, a man of business trusted by families far above his own. He was a quiet, exact man, who had spent the better part of 30 years keeping the settlements and private affairs of the great and faultless order, and his single vanity was that, in all that time, no client had lost so much as a shilling through his hand. Men left their fortunes in his keeping without a second thought, because Marrow was careful and Marrow was honest, and everyone who dealt with him knew it for a certainty. Then a great inheritance went astray. A deed came to light that turned a fortune meant for one family into the property of another, and the deed was a forgery, a patient and a clever one, and the hand that had drawn it was said before the court to be Mr. Marrow's own. 2 men of standing swore they had watched him write it, and a third swore to the honesty of the first 2, and there was no one of standing to swear the other way. For the men who will trust a quiet solicitor in the sunshine are seldom to be found near him once it begins to rain. Her father was ruined inside a month. He was struck from the rolls. His name was said in the largest type the spiteful papers kept, and the fortune he was said to have taken was never found upon him, nor near him, which the world read not as the proof of his innocence, but as the proof of his cunning. He died within the year. The physicians wrote it down as a failing of the heart, which was true enough, though not in the sense they intended. Linnet had been at the bed. She had heard him say, in a voice gone strange and small, that he had never once set his pen to a falsehood, that some other hand had studied his letters until it could counterfeit them and had left his name to answer for the whole of it. She believed him yet. It changed nothing anywhere, for no weight of a daughter's certainty could rub out a single line of what had been written down and sworn to before a court. So the doors began to close, slowly at first, and then, all at once together. The friends who had dined so gladly at the Marrow table found that they were much engaged, and the great families her father had served so long discovered of a sudden that they had never really known him. Linnet and her mother went out of the world they had belonged to, into a smaller and a colder one, and lived there quietly for years upon the little that was left them. 2 women alone, with a poisoned name, keeping up their respectability by the narrowest of margins and troubling nobody. Then, 2 winters before this one, her mother died, and the last of the little died with her, and Linnet found herself wholly alone and very near the end of her means. She had sold by then everything that could be sold, and had gone out into the cold to look for the one respectable thing still left to a ruined gentlewoman, which was a place as a governess or a companion, some small warm corner where she might make herself useful in exchange for her bread and a share of the fire. She did not find one. The name went before her like a draught of cold air under a door. She learned to keep it back until the very last, for it was the name that ended things, and once it had been spoken there was no use in saying more. She came to know the particular smile that meant no, and the silence that meant the same, and the false regret and the true contempt beneath it, and she taught herself to take all of them without letting her face do anything at all. She made a private rule, too, of thanking every one of them for their trouble, for reasons she could not have set out plainly, except that it left the meanness all on their side of the door, and none of it on hers. She had one good pair of gloves, and she kept them clean past all reason, washing them by candle at night and drying them flat, and she drew them on before she knocked at any door in the town. Whatever the world stripped from her, it would not have the last of her order too. They might refuse Miss Marrow. They would not refuse a slattern on the step, for she would give them no slattern to refuse. It was a small thing and very near the only thing she had left, and she held to it the way a drowning man holds to a floating spar, not because it can save him, but because it is his, and his hand has closed upon it, and he will not open his hand. By the end of that second winter, the little money was gone, and the good gloves were wearing through at the seams, where no more washing would ever save them. And Linnet Marrow understood, standing in the grey street with the light going out of the day, that she had perhaps a fortnight left before the choice was taken out of her hands for good. It was then, on a raw afternoon, with the dark coming down early over the roofs, that the letter came. It was a single sheet, folded once and sealed with a plain wafer, her name upon the outside, in a spare and upright hand she had never seen. She broke it open on the pavement, in the failing light, her fingers clumsy inside the worn gloves. Braced as she had taught herself always to be braced, for some fresh unkindness, some old reckoning come round for its due. It was 4 lines. It said that she was offered marriage by His Grace, the Duke of Aldermore, that the settlement made upon her would be generous, and hers alone and absolutely, whatever might afterward come to pass. It said a carriage would be sent within the week, if she were willing, and that she need bring nothing, an answer to no one upon the road. There was no word of love in it, and no word of reason, and no flattery of any kind, and this, strangely, was the thing that made her read it through 3 times, for she had grown used to a world in which every offered thing cost more than its price, and here was a thing held out, with no honey upon it at all. At the foot of the page, drawn larger than the rest, stood a single letter, an A, made the way a man makes the one mark he has set down 10,000 times and no longer troubles to make handsome. She stood a long while with the paper in her hand. Then she asked the man who had brought it, a grave older servant in a plain dark coat, whose house it was that had sent for her. He told her the one word, and Linnet Marrow, who had thought there was nothing left in the world with the power to frighten her, felt the cold go down a little deeper, for she knew the name of Aldermore, as every soul in England knew it. The Duke of Aldermore was a man the world spoke of only in the low voice that is kept for the mad and the ruined, and the very great brought suddenly down. He had come into the title and the old house of Cottermere while he was scarcely more than a boy, and for a season he had been all that such a man is looked to be. Then a thing had happened at Cottermere that no one living could give you the whole of, and after it the Duke had gone silent, and gone north, and there remained. He did not come up to town, nor take his seat among the lords, nor, so the whisper ran, so much as sit at the head of his own table any longer, but had given his house over to run itself beneath the hand of a widowed kinswoman. Some said grief had broken him, that he had loved a wife and lost her early, and never after mended. Some said it was not grief but guilt, that there was a thing done once at Cottermere that its walls knew, and that the family would pay any sum to keep those walls from telling it. Upon one point, they were all agreed. Whatever else the Duke of Aldermore might be, he was not a man that any woman with a choice left to her would ever go to. But there was the whole of it. Linnet Marrow had no choice left. She had a fortnight and a failing pair of gloves and a name that shut every respectable door in England. And here, of all the doors in the world, was one standing open, and she could not for the life of her think why. She thought of what became, in the end, of gentlewomen who went north alone, with no money, and no one to ask after them. She thought of her father, and of the one promise she had never kept to him, which was only that she would be well, that his last thought of her might be an easy one. And she folded the 4 lines along their crease, slipped them inside her glove against the pulse of her wrist, and told the grave old servant that she was willing. The carriage came upon the 4th day, plain and very finely kept, and warm within. On the seat lay a rug of soft gray wool. A stone had been heated for her feet, and in a covered basket there was bread and cold meat, and a flask still hot against the hand. Someone had thought of her comfort before ever she arrived to be thought of, and no one had done so much in 2 years. She sat very still in the midst of all this quiet care, and found, to her disgust, that her eyes had begun to sting. They went north 2 days out of the world she had known, and into a colder and a wider one, the towns thinning to villages, and the villages to open country lying white beneath old snow. Toward the dusk of the 2nd day, the road came up over the shoulder of a long hill, and below, in a wooded valley, she saw the lights of a great house burning gold against the coming dark, the smoke of its chimneys standing straight up into the still and freezing air. It looked, against all sense, and all her bracing, welcoming, with the look of a place cared for, down to its very stones. She had made herself ready for something grim and shut, and this was worse, in a way she could not have named, for grimness she would have known how to meet. And somewhere within that warm and waiting house, though she did not yet know the first thing of it, a ring of iron and brass keys hung at the waist of a woman who had no intention upon this earth of ever setting them into another hand. The door was opened before the carriage had well stopped, and a woman came out onto the steps with a lamp, a stout woman of middle years, with a kind and anxious face, who took Linnet's cold hands into both of her own, as though they were something precious, and drew her in out of the dark. This was Mrs. Quennell, the housekeeper. Whatever else Linnet had braced herself to meet at Cottermere, she had not braced herself for a welcome, for warmth in the old stones and lamplight in the hall and the smell of wood smoke and baking bread, for a house that plainly did not know it was supposed to be grim. She was given a room high under the old roof, with a fire already burning well and lately tended, and hot water brought up and a supper on a tray, and Mrs. Butt, Quennell saying that her grace must be worn to the bone, and must not think of coming down that night. That morning was time enough for all things. Her grace. It took Linnet a moment to understand that the words were meant for her. They were married the next morning. It was done in the old chapel at the cold end of the house, with frost on the windows and their breath standing in the air, by a nervous clergyman who hurried the words as though he feared to be overheard. There were 3 to witness it. An old lady in black, with bright, restless eyes, whom no one had yet named to her. Mrs. Quennell, who wept a little and tried not to be seen at it, and a handsome woman of perhaps 50, in gray silk, who watched the whole of it with a small and pleasant smile, and did not once take her eyes from Linnet's face. And there was the Duke. She saw her husband for the first time, as she stood beside him at the rail. He was tall and spare, with gray coming early into fair hair, and his face was still in the way that deep water is still, giving nothing back but the light that fell on it. His eyes were dark and deep-set and rested on nothing. His hands, she saw, were faintly stained with ink at the fingers, as though he had been at his writing an hour before his own wedding, and would be at it again an hour after. He spoke the words the clergyman gave him, and his voice was low and level and used as sparingly as a voice can be, and still do its office. He set a ring upon her finger. He did not smile, and he did not frown, and when it was over, he bowed to her, a small and perfectly correct bow, and looked at her one long moment with those dark, unreadable eyes, and then was gone out through a side door, and she was a duchess. The old lady in black snorted not unkindly, and said it was the coldest wedding she had witnessed in 80 years, and she had witnessed some cold ones, and that Linnet was not to mind it, for Alaric had never in his life managed a warm thing where anyone could watch him do it. Then she took Linnet's arm in a small, strong hand and steered her off toward breakfast, talking the whole way. And Linnet, who had not the least idea yet who she was grateful past telling for the noise of her, for it asked nothing, and it filled the terrible quiet the Duke had left behind him. It was at that breakfast that Linnet first understood the true shape of the house she had married into. The table was laid long and fine, and at the head of it stood a great carved chair, and the chair was empty. It was not waiting to be filled. It had the look of a thing that had stood empty a great while, and no one so much as glanced at it. The Duke did not come to breakfast, nor she would learn to any meal at all. And the place at the foot of the table that should by every right have been hers, the mistress's place, was taken easily and wholly by the handsome woman in gray. She was presented now, Lady Ashcroft, a widowed connection of the family, who had kept the house these many years, and would, said the cool, pleasant voice, be so glad to take every least care off the new Duchess's hands, for a young bride fresh come to a strange cold country ought not to be troubled with keys and account books and the tedious business of a place this size. And as she said the word keys, she touched, without appearing to, the ring of them at her own waist, iron and brass on a chain of worn steel, the truer deed to Cottermere. She smiled at Linnet with great sweetness. And Linnet understood that she had been welcomed and weighed, and set gently and finely in her place, all in a single breath, and that her place was to be mistress of nothing whatever. The old lady in black was the Duke's great-aunt, Lady Araminta, his grandfather's youngest sister, who had lived at Cottermere since before he was born, and meant to die there, and said so freely. She was near 80 and afraid of nothing under heaven, and took it upon herself in those first strange days to be Linnet's guide and guard, though she would have scorned the word. She talked from morning until night, a dry, wicked commentary on the house and the county, and the failings of everyone in both, and it was some days before Linnet understood the talk was a mercy, that the old woman had seen her fright, and was covering it with words the way one covers a shivering creature with a blanket. "Ask me what you like," she said on the third day, when Linnet had been too well bred to ask her anything at all. "You are burning to ask." So Linnet asked the one thing she could not stop asking herself, why the Duke had married her. Why her, a ruined man's daughter with a poisoned name and not a shilling to it, a woman he had never so much as seen. The old woman's bright eyes went still a moment, and something moved behind them and was put away. "Pray, that," she said, "you must have from him if you can get it, which I do not promise, for I have been getting things out of Alaric for 30 years and grown old in the trying. I will tell you this only. He does nothing without a reason, and his reasons are a great deal better than he is. Now, pour the tea, you are letting it stew." And that was the whole of it, and it was its own kind of answer, for it told her there was a reason, and that the reason was a secret, and that even this old woman who feared nothing would not lay a finger on it. She saw her husband next, at the gray edge of a morning. She had not slept, the northern dark ran very deep, and toward dawn she rose and went softly down through the sleeping house, not knowing what she looked for, only that she could not lie still. At the end of a cold passage she found one door with a line of light beneath it, and she had it open before she thought, and there was the Duke. It was a small, plain room, lined to the ceiling with deed boxes and ledgers, and the long paper memory of the estate, and it was warm, and he sat at a table in the lamplight, with the pen in his ink-stained hand, and he looked up at her without the least surprise. as though he had always known she would come to that door in the end, and had only wondered which morning it would be. She began to beg his pardon and withdraw. He would not have it. He did not speak, or barely, but rose and set a chair for her at the fire in a way that left no room to refuse. She had braced herself, through 2 bad days, against a husband who would come to her door in the dark and take what men take for their right. Here instead was a man who set a chair for her at a decent distance, went back to his papers, and left her wholly alone, wanting nothing of her that she could see. It was so far from her fear that she had no name for it. She watched the pen go, and after a while she was no longer afraid, and that frightened her more than the fear had. When the light came gray at the pane, he gathered his papers, bowed to her, and went, and she sat on alone, and thought that she understood not one thing about the man she had married. The next morning there was something left upon the table by her fire, a folded paper in the lean, upright hand, and within it a single old key of black iron. "The room at the top of the south stair is a library," said the note. "It is yours. No one will trouble you there. The key is the only one there is, and it is yours now, and no others." She stood a long while with the small, cold weight of it in her palm. She was mistress of a great house and held not one key to a single door of it, and here was a man who could not, or would not, give her the keys that were hers by right, and gave her instead, in secret, the one key it lay in his power to give. She strung it upon a ribbon and wore it beneath her gown against her skin, where Lady Ashcroft's clever eyes would never find it, and she told no one, and it was the first thing at Cottermere that was truly and only hers. Lady Ashcroft found her out inside the week, for she found out everything in the end. She said no word of the key. She only remarked, over the tea, that the South Library was a damp and worm-eaten room, quite unfit for a duchess, and that she could not conceive what drew dear Linnet up to it, and that she did so hope dear Linnet would not take to making herself peculiar, for the county did talk, and this house had known trouble enough already with peculiar ways. She smiled the whole while she said it, and beneath the sweetness, plain as a blade laid out upon the cloth between them, lay a thing that was not sweet in the least, and Linnet understood that she had just been warned. With her one key, her one room, and the wakeful dawn she could not give up, Linnet began, without ever meaning to learn the true shape of the man she had married, and it bore no likeness at all to the shape the world had drawn of him. The world said the Duke of Aldermore did nothing, that he brooded, that he was mad or broken or too proud to stir a hand. What he did, in truth, was work, ceaselessly and in silence, out of that small plain room, at the running of a great estate and a great many things that were no part of any estate at all. Letters went out from Cottermere by the score in the lean upright hand. She had supposed it all rents and leases and the dull matter of land. It was not. She began in pieces to see where the letters went and what went out with them, and it unmade every certainty she had carried north. She saw the first of it in the matter of a housemaid, a young thing named Effie, found that winter to be with child and no husband to answer for it. Lady Ashcroft turned her off the same day, without a character, into weather that would have killed a strong man on the road, and called it the good of the house and the morals of the younger girls, and there was no appeal, for the keys were hers, and the ordering of the servants was hers. Linnet heard of it too late to stop it and lay awake half the night sick over it, and then a strange thing came about. Within the month, word reached her through Mrs. Sesta Quesnel that the girl was not dead in any ditch but settled in a decent cottage 20 miles off, her lying in, paid for, a sum set by for the child, and a place promised her when she should be strong again, all of it come from she knew not where, arranged by a lawyer who would say only that it had been seen to. No name to it, and no thanks possible, Mrs. Duchess. Quesnel told the tale with her apron at her eyes and never said whose doing it was, and had no need to, and Linnet, who had begun to keep a kind of ledger of her own inside her head, set it down in it. She met the next of it in the flesh. Walking out one raw afternoon to the village on an errand of Lady Araminta's, She fell into talk with an old shepherd who was mending a wall, and who did not know her for the Duchess, and spoke to her as country folk will speak to any stranger who will stop and listen. He had come near to losing all he had the winter before. He told her the snow had taken half his flock, and he, 2 years behind, already with his rent, and the agent had begun to speak of the road. He had lain awake nights waiting for the end of it to come. And then the agent had come indeed, but the agent had brought a paper that wiped the arrears clean away, and 2 years more along with them. And beside the paper there was money told out for new ewes, and never a word of who had willed it so. A fund, they had told him. He leaned on his half-built wall and looked at her out of pale old eyes. "There is no fund, missus," he said, "that walks a man's top field in the dark to count his dead sheep before ever the agent is out of his bed. I have never seen his face. But I know there is a face, and I know it is not the grand lady up at the house that takes the thanks for it. I say a prayer at night for a man I cannot put a name to, and I have a notion it is heard." After that she saw it everywhere. Once she had the eyes for it. A great physician sent the whole way from Edinburgh to a carter's dying child, the fee paid before he set out by a hand, the family never traced, and the child lived. A laborer as good as certain of transportation for a theft he swore he had not done, saved at the last by a clever lawyer come from nowhere, who broke the case wide open and would take no thanks for it. Always the same care taken. Always a fund, a lawyer, a hand drawn back before the light could fall on it. The good was real, and the doer of it a rumor, and up at the house Lady Ashcroft dispensed her small measured charities in the family name, and was called throughout the county a most gracious lady, while the man who did the true and secret good of the place sat in a cold back room and wanted none of the credit for himself. Linnet asked Lady Araminta of it, once, and carefully, why he hid it so, why any man should take such pains that his own goodness be never known. The old woman was long in answering, and when she answered, she did not look at Linnet, but into the fire. "It is not modesty," she said, "and I will thank you not to fall into the easy error of calling it modesty, for it is a harder and a sadder thing than that. He does not believe that anything of his that is merely said, a word, a promise, his name, his own name, is worth the breath spent upon it. He trusts only what he can do with his 2 hands and his money in the dark, for those things are real, and cannot be taken up and turned against the very person they were meant to help. A word can be turned so. He learned that once, in the hardest school there is." She stopped, and Linnet felt the edge of the secret there in the room again. "He was not always as he is," said Lady Araminta, lower now. "Once he was the most open-hearted creature you could wish to meet, and he loved a girl and married her, and he held it for a certainty, in the way of the young, that an honest word spoken out plainly must in the end be heard. He tried once to speak such a word, and to set a great wrong to rights by the plain saying of it. It cost him every hope he had, and it cost that poor young wife of his her life, and it did not mend the wrong by so much as an inch. After that he ceased to speak, and gave up his place at the head of every table. And he put the keys of his own house into the hand of the one soul on this earth he has most reason in the world to hate. If you would know why he did that last and strangest thing, you must ask him yourself, for it is the black heart of the whole matter, and it is not mine to tell you." And she would say no more that day. And Linnet went up to her cold library with her one black key, and sat among the worm and the old paper, the whole of the afternoon, holding in her 2 hands the little she had been given, and turning it, and turning it. A man who had loved and lost and been broken of his very voice by it, a great wrong he had tried to right and could not, a young wife in her grave these many years, and the keys of Cottermere freely given to the one person he had most cause on earth to hate, and not a living soul who would tell her why. After that, the grey hour became a thing they shared, though neither of them ever named it or agreed to it aloud. Linnet would come down through the sleeping house to the estate room and the Duke would already be there among his papers, and he would rise and set the chair for her without a word, and she would sit, and the two of them would keep the early dark together until the window turned gray. It ought to have been a strange and comfortless arrangement. It was neither. She had never in her life been so wholly at ease inside a silence. They came, in time, to talk, though it was a manner of talking she had never met before. He did not speak readily even now, and she began to see that speech cost him a thing she did not yet understand, that words came up out of him slowly and with great care, as though each were hauled from a long way down. So he took instead to writing to her. She would say something aloud, a thought upon the book in her lap, some quarrel she had picked with its author, and he would listen with that whole dark attention of his, and after a while he would set a line on a slip of paper and pass it across, and it would be his answer, dry and exact, and to her surprise often very funny. She would answer the slip aloud, and he would write again. It was the strangest correspondence in England, carried on between two people sat in the same small room, half spoken and half written, at the pace of a man who would not put a word down until he was sure of it. And it was, she came to think, the truest talk of her whole life, for a man who must write a thing before he will say it does not write it lightly, and every line he passed her was weighed, and honest, and meant. She kept the slips. She could not have told a soul why. She kept them folded in the drawer of her dressing table alongside her one black key, a small and growing stack in the lean upright hand, and she told herself it was only that they were the nearest thing to conversation she had. But it was more than that, and she knew that it was more, and the knowing frightened her in the old way, the way the lit fire had frightened her, and the unpriced kindness had frightened her, for it meant that she had begun to want a thing again, and she had learned once already what came of wanting. There was one exchange she kept above all the rest. She had been reading some grave, dull sermon upon the duties of a wife, all obedience and meekness, and the keeping of a still tongue, and said, half to herself, that the man who wrote it had plainly never married, for no one who had lived beside a wife could think so little of what she might say. The Duke wrote a line and passed it over. He never married, it said. It is always the ones who never married who are surest how it is done. She laughed aloud, the first time she had laughed in that house, and told him that was wicked and very likely true, and did he never think well of anybody. He wrote again. Seldom. It spares me the disappointment. And then, after a moment, a second slip, which he seemed to weigh before he let it go. I make one or two exceptions. They are more trouble than the rule. I am given to understand they are worth it. He did not look at her while she read it. He looked into the fire, and she did not answer aloud, for she found she could not, and folded it quietly away with the others. It was in that same season that a county lady came to call, a Mrs. Vereker, a great goer about and a greater talker, who came twice a year to sit an hour with Lady Araminta and bear away whatever she could gather. She looked the new Duchess over with a frank, hard curiosity, and worked her way across the tea toward the thing she had truly come for. Of course, she said comfortably, one does hear such sad things of His Grace. They say he is not quite, you know. And she touched her own temple and smiled. The silence is not natural in a man. My husband holds that a man who will not speak has something he dare not say. Lynette set down her cup. She had not meant to speak. She heard herself speak. Your husband is mistaken, she said. I have lived beneath this roof some months. In that time I have known a turned-off girl kept from the ditch, a broken farmer kept in his fields, a dying child given back its life, and an innocent man kept off the transport ship, and every last stroke of it done by a hand that took the greatest care in the world never to be seen or thanked. That is not a man with something he dare not say. That is a man who long ago decided that saying is the cheapest coin there is, and doing the dearest, and who chooses to spend only the dear one. I could wish there were more like him, and a good deal fewer who tap their brows over the tea. There was a silence. Mrs. Vereker's smile went stiff and stayed so. Across the room, Lady Araminta gave a small, dry cough into her needlework that fooled no one, and Linnet, her heart going hard, understood two things in the same instant: that she had just been unpardonably rude to a guest beneath her own roof, and that she had meant every word of it, and would say it all again, and was not in the least sorry. She did not know then that he heard of it. He heard of everything at Cottermere. That night there was a slip left for her on the estate room table in the lean, upright hand. It said only, "Mrs. Vereker is not worth one word of yours. You spent a great many on my account. I thank you for them." It was the first time he had ever written her the word thank, and she kept that slip apart from all the others. He had not planned for any of this. He had planned the marriage as he planned all things, in silence and with care. A debt with a clean shape that a man might pay, and be quit of. Find the daughter, shelter her, settle enough upon her to keep her safe whatever came, and see the old wrong righted at the last, once he had the means, a sum owed and a sum paid. He had not counted on a wife who would tell him to his face that he was wrong about a book, and be right, and not take a word of it back for his being a duke. He had not counted on the way the cold house warmed with her in it, nor on his coming down to the grey hour, not from habit, but because the silence there was, for the first time in 10 years, not empty. There were mornings, watching her frown over a page, when the words rose in him like a spring under a stone, and he must set them in ink, or not let them out at all, for he no longer trusted the wanting. He had wanted to speak once with his whole heart, and the world had shown him the worth of it, and it cost a life he would have laid his own down to keep. So he wrote his slips, and kept his wall, and told himself it sufficed. And he knew, in the hour when a man cannot lie to himself, that it had not sufficed for a long while now, and that whatever he had built to keep the world out was failing at the foundations, and he could not have said what would be left standing of him when it fell. She was falling, and she knew it, and she could not stop, and worst of all, she no longer greatly wished to. It was Lady Araminta who told her the truth of it in the end, or the heart of the truth. It was a hard, bright afternoon late in the winter, and the old woman looked at her a long while over her needlework, and then set the needlework down. "You still do not know why he sent for you," she said. "It is eating you alive, and I have watched it all winter. I am going to break my word to him and tell you, for I am 80 years old, and have earned the right to break a word or two before I go, and because I see you working towards some foolishness out of not knowing, and I would rather your foolishness had a little knowledge under it." She folded her hands. "Do you know the way your father was brought down, child? The whole truth of it, or only the version they set in the papers?" Linnet said that she knew he had not done it. "No," said Lady Araminta, "he did not do it. There was a man who did. A clever, charming, much-respected man named Sir Cassian Ashcroft, who forged that deed with his own hand and left your father's name to answer for it, and who died at last in his own bed. A rich and honored man, the stolen fortune, long since folded quietly into his estate. What he did to your father died respectable along with him, and would have lain buried forever but for one living soul who knew the truth of it, and could not prove a word." She looked at Linnet steadily. "My nephew knew the truth. Your father had been the Aldermore man of business 30 years and more, and the nearest thing to a true father Alaric ever had, for his own was a cold, hard man, and Marrow was not. When the blow fell, Alaric knew in his bones that Marrow was innocent, and knew who was guilty, for he had once seen a thing he was never meant to see. He was 25, certain in the way of the young that a truth cried loudly enough from a high enough place must be heard, so he cried it. He stood up before the whole gathered weight of the county, and named Sir Cassian Ashcroft a forger and a thief, and swore your father guiltless, and staked his name and his honor on it. And they broke him for it," said the old woman, and her voice was level and terrible. "Ashcroft was powerful and beloved, and Alaric a raw, grieving boy with no proof but his own certainty, and Ashcroft's friends closed over him like water over a stone. They called him mad, a hysterical boy, unstrung by private grief, and they were clever enough to turn his very outcry into one more stone to throw at your father. His speaking did not lift Manor up, it helped to bury him the deeper. Linnet sat very still, and the grief they spoke of was real, said Lady Araminta, and here at last her voice was not level. For while Alaric was in London spending himself on that hopeless battle, his wife was here, Amabel, a gentle girl, gentler than was good for her, and near her time with their first child. The shame of it reached even to this house, and she was frightened, and she was alone. Her time came early and hard, and there was no one beside her that she loved. She died, and the child with her, on the very night he stood 300 miles off, losing everything for nothing. He came home to a new grave, a wrecked name, and the word that Manor too was dead, and something in him that had stood open all his life shut on that day, and has not opened since. The room was very quiet. "That is what he carries," said the old woman. He spoke a true thing with his whole heart, and the truth was worth nothing, and the speaking did harm, and while he spoke, the one creature he loved best died alone for want of him. There is nothing under heaven so apt to cure a man of speech. It cured him. He gave up his chair at the head of the table, for that is the place where a man speaks, and is heard, and he had done with being heard. He does his good now in the dark, with his hands and his money, where no word of his need be trusted by anyone, and he set himself in that same dark, to the one labor that might mend a little of it. He began to gather the proof he had not owned at 25, the proof that would clear your father's name at the last. Linnet found her voice. "And Lady Ashcroft," she said. "Why is she here? Why does she carry the keys?" The old woman's face went grim as deep winter, because she is Cassian Ashcroft's widow, and a far cleverer creature than her husband ever was, and because she found among his papers, when he died, the weapons he had laid by against the day my nephew might find his tongue again. Letters. Cruel, lying letters that could take poor dead Amabel and paint her death a wicked scandal, a thing it never was. She came to my nephew with those letters and put a plain bargain to him. 1. He would keep silent and let her husband lie safe in his shining name, and she would let Amabel lie safe in hers, and to seal it, and to keep herself where she might watch and be watched, he gave her the run of this house and its keys. She has ruled here ever since, a guest who is also a jailer, and he has borne her year upon year to keep the grave of the girl. He failed from being dug open before the county. She looked at Linnet. "There. Now you know why the fire was lit for you before ever you asked, and why the settlement is yours whatever befalls, and why a silent man married a ruined stranger he had never seen. It was never a wife he sought, but a debt he meant to pay. He could give your father back neither life nor name, and undo no hour of what was done. But the man's daughter was living somewhere still, made to pay for a wrong that was never hers, and my nephew has not forgotten a single day that he owes her all he failed to give the father. When word reached him that you were in London, turned from every door, he did the one thing a silent man had left to do. He opened a door of his own, and she took up her needlework again, with hands not quite steady, and said no more. Linnet sat a long while in the bright, cold room after the old woman had gone, and understood now a great many things. She understood the debt she had read in the dark eyes that first gray morning, and the fire and the black key, and the settlement that was hers, come what might, and the whole cold machinery of his silence. And she understood, with a pang that stopped her breath, the thing beneath all the rest, that every gentleness of that long, strange winter had never been meant for her, but for her father, or the ghost of him, and for the old guilt that would not let the man rest. It had never entered his reckoning that the daughter herself might come to be someone he could not do without. And she understood that she had come to want him, to want her. That she had fallen, somewhere in that winter of lit fires and folded slips of paper, past all saving in love with a husband who did not love her, who believed himself only to be squaring an old account with a dead man. It was a bitter dose for a proud woman, and her pride was very near all she had carried out of the wreck of her old life. For a day or two, she thought the only bearable course was to take the knowing and go. And then she did not go, and the reason she did not go turned all the rest, for it was not weakness, and not even the love, though the love was folded inside it. It was that she had seen in the gray hours in the estate room the man who stood behind the debt, and had come to think there was more to him than the guilt that drove him, and that the more of him was worth the staying, whatever it cost her pride. She could not turn her back on a man who had shut himself in the dark 10 years over a wound no soul had ever tried to heal when she might be the one person living who could. She had come north to be kept safe, and she stayed because she had begun to think she might be the one who could keep him. For to a woman who had lost all else, a thing to give was worth more than any warm room, and so she stayed. She went down to the estate room the next gray morning as always, and he was there as always, and rose and set the chair for her as always. But all of it was changed now, for now she knew, and he saw that she knew, and she did not try to hide it. He looked at her across the small warm room, with the whole of the winter and the whole of the old wound plain in his dark eyes, and there was no slip of paper in his hand to shelter behind, and he did not reach for one. Neither of them spoke. How long it lasted she could never afterward have told. Then a coal shifted in the grate and the spell broke, and he bent again to his papers, and she to her book. But it had happened, and they had both been there when it happened, and a moment like that, once come, cannot be taken back, however long the two who shared it go on pretending it never came. And elsewhere in the great house, a clever woman who missed nothing felt the air of Cottermere Altar, and did not like it, and began, very quietly, to consider what must be done. The Duke moved first, and he moved in the one language he had never yet been willing to use against her, the language of the keys. He came into the morning room a few days after, where Lady Ashcroft sat at her accounts with the great ring of iron and brass at her waist, and Linnet with her. He did not sit. He said in that low-used voice that he thanked Lady Ashcroft for her long care of his house, and that the care would no longer be needed, for the Duchess would keep her own keys now, as was her right. And he held out his ink-stained hand. There was a silence you could have broken like ice. Then Lady Ashcroft smiled her pleasant smile, and unhooked the ring from her waist, and laid it in his open palm with the grace of a woman conceding a trifle. "Of course," she said, "how stupid of me not to have pressed them upon dear Linnet long ago." And she went on smiling, while the Duke put the great cold ring into Linnet's 2 hands, and Linnet felt the weight of the whole house come into them at last, and knew, even as she closed her fingers upon it, that she had been handed not a gift, but a declaration of war, and that the smiling woman across the table understood that far better than she did. The counterstroke came inside a fortnight, and it came the way such things always come, softly, from every side at once, with no hand ever quite visible behind it. She began where the malicious have always begun, with the young wife's good name, and the cruelty of it lay in how little effort it took. A girl wed in haste and near secrecy to a man half the county believed mad, a forger's daughter carrying a poisoned name, and now mistress of his house and keeper of his keys, was a thing that wanted only to be named aloud in the right tone, with the right small sigh after it, and the naming did the rest by itself. Lady Ashcroft took it up, with every show of reluctance, with a rueful shake of her handsome head, in drawing-room after drawing-room. How sad it was, how very sad, that his Grace, who was surely not himself, one feared in his mind, should have let himself be so worked upon by a scheming girl come out of nowhere, whose own father, whatever one wished to believe, had died a proven forger, and how one did fear for the old family. And she let the small sigh carry the weight of the rest. Inside a month the thing was on every tongue in the county. The few doors that had opened to the new Duchess of Aldermore swung shut again, one after another, and there was a dreadful familiarity in the shutting, for Linnet had stood on the wrong side of doors exactly like these before. It reached its cruelest one afternoon, when she drove out with Lady Araminta to call at a house where the old woman had been welcome for 50 years. The daughter of the house came down the steps herself, pink and miserable, to stammer that her mother begged to be excused and was not receiving. Lady Araminta, 80 years old and never once in the whole of her life turned from a door before, sat bolt upright and did not say a word until they had rounded the corner and left the place behind. Then she spoke, and her voice shook with a fury Linnet had never heard in her. "So this is what we have come to," she said. "They would sooner bar their doors to me, at my age, over a lie than breathe one cold word against that woman." And beneath the fury Linnet heard the hurt of it, and knew with a sick certainty that her presence was ruining the one soul who had been wholly kind to her, and that the decent thing, the sole remaining decent thing, was the very thing she had refused a month before, to go. She learned the last of it from Mrs. Quennell, who came to her, white and frightened, and would not at first say why, and then said it, that there was talk of letters. That Lady Ashcroft had let it be known, to those who carried tales, that she held letters touching the first Duchess, poor Amabel, and that if she were crossed, if she were made to feel unwelcome in the house she had served so faithfully, the world might yet learn things about that sad old death that a great family would give its right hand to keep buried. And Linnet understood then the full shape of the trap. That her own coming had set a blade to the throat of the dead girl. The Duke had loved and failed. That so long as she stayed and was his wife, and held those keys, Lady Ashcroft had every reason to open that grave, and a fresh reason with every passing day. That she was not only ruining Araminta and the living name of Aldermore. She was, by the plain fact of staying, forcing her husband to choose between the truth he had gathered 10 years to tell and the memory of the girl he had buried. She sat alone that night, in the cold south library, with her one black key on its ribbon and the great iron ring beside it on the table, and she made the choice a proud woman makes when there is at last no bearable choice left. She would give the keys back, she would go and take the whole poisoned tangle of it away with her, and leave him his peace, and his aunt her friends, and the dead girl her rest. It was the one thing she had left that she could do for any of them, and having decided it, she found that she was calm. In the morning she would tell him. She sat and watched the fire burn down and did not weep, for she had schooled herself long ago to go without weeping, a thing that cost far more than it was worth, and she meant to keep the last of that hard discipline for exactly this. She went to him at the gray hour, as she had gone all winter, but not to sit. He was at his papers, and looked up, and something crossed the still face at the sight of her, a knowledge of what she had come to say already in his eyes before she had said a word. "You must let me go," she said, and said it plainly, standing, because he was a man who trusted only real things. "I know all of it now, what my father was, and what you did for him, and what it cost you. This was never a marriage, but a debt, and you have paid it 10 times over. And I know what that woman holds, and what my staying does to it. Every day I am under this roof is another day. She can dig up your Amabel and shame her, and you will have to choose, and I will not be the thing that makes you choose. Let me go, and let the talk go out of the house with me. It is the only gift I have left to give, and I am asking you to let me give it." There was a long silence, unlike the other silences. She watched him take up his pen, out of 10 years of habit, to write his answer, and watched him look at it in his ink-stained hand and set it down again. And then the Duke of Aldermore, who had not willingly strung a dozen words together before anyone in 10 years, did the one thing he had promised himself he would never do again. He got to his feet, came round the desk, and stood so close that she had to tip her face up to his. And then he spoke. "No," he said. Only the one word, low and cracked from long want of use, and the saying of it plainly cost him, and Lynette thought she had never heard a sound so remarkable as that single rough syllable. "No," he said a second time, and it held steadier. "You are not leaving this house. I let you believe it was a debt, because a debt was a thing I knew how to shoulder without speaking, and I have shouldered everything without speaking 10 years. It was a debt once. It has not been one for a long time. It stopped being a debt the morning you told me I had misread a book, and were right, and did not soften it by a hair for my being a duke. I never told you so. I had stopped believing, years before, that any word of mine could make a thing safe, or true, or worth the danger of the saying. I called that fear by finer names for a long while. You have worn it out of me now, and I will not take it up again." He drew a breath, and it shook. "I have kept a truth behind my teeth 10 years to leave one grave undisturbed, and called it faithfulness. Amabel would have called it by its right name. She was gentler than I am, but she was never a coward, and she would not have thanked me for lying quiet in her grave at the price of your father's name and the whole of your life. I will keep silent no longer, not for that woman, and not for fear." He stopped. "Stay," he said more quietly. "I have 10 years of things stored up that I have said to no one, and I have quite lost the order they ought to come in, but I will find it again, if you will only stay and be patient while I do. First, there is a thing I ought to have done 10 years since, and could not, for want of the weight to do it with. I have the weight now. Go up and sleep. Trust me in this, and I will hear no more from you on the subject of leaving. For I have lately discovered it is the one matter on earth I can be eloquent about." She could not answer him. She, who had done the whole of the talking that long winter, stood in the doorway of his study without a word to her name, and the faint beginning of something that was very nearly a smile moved at the hard corner of his mouth. "Harder than it looks," he said, "when the turn to speak comes round to you. Now go. I have letters to write tonight, and for the first time in 10 years I know, to the last word, what they must say." The dinner was of Lady Ashcroft's own contriving, and she meant it for the seal upon her victory. She had the whole neighborhood to Cottermere, every family of any weight within a day's drive, and they came agog with the story that had run round the county all winter, of the strange half-mad duke and the forger's girl he had married. They came, certain as she was certain, of how the night must go. The disgraced girl scorned at a table full of the very people who had shut their doors against her, the old aunt shut out beside her, and the duke mute at the edge of it as he had been for 10 years, letting the tide bear the two women out to sea. For everyone knew he could no sooner rise to defend a living soul than the dead could rise to speak for themselves. Lady Ashcroft came down in her best grey silk and was received like a reigning queen, and allowed herself, moving from guest to guest, a soft, regretful word about poor dear Lynette, of whom she sighed, the less said now the kinder. She watched her soft words go about their work, and was well content. She was so content that she did not at first mark the small strangeness at the head of the long table, where the great carved chair that had stood empty in the memory of nearly everyone present was empty no longer. The Duke of Aldermore sat in it. He had taken his own place at the head of his own table, and though a few murmured, most supposed he would sit as mute as ever through the courses and then withdraw. Toward the end of the dinner he rose. He lifted his glass, and the long, bright room fell by degrees into a startled hush, for the silent man was on his feet and plainly meant to speak, and no one there had heard him make a speech of 6 words in 10 years. "A toast to Lady Ashcroft," he said, rough at first, and then steadying, and it carried the whole length of the room. And down the table his young Duchess, without haste and without a word, took up the great ring of iron and brass keys from beside her own plate, where it had lain all the evening in plain view, and set it down gently beside Lady Ashcroft's plate. For one breath, the whole room read it, exactly as they had been meant, all that winter, to read it. The Duke doing honor to the woman who ruled his house, the beaten girl, surrendering the keys back to her better in front of them all. Lady Ashcroft's smile deepened. It was the sweetest moment of her life, and it lasted exactly one breath. "To Lady Ashcroft," said the Duke again, and now his voice did not steady into courtesy, but into something else, low and level and terrible, who has kept my house these 10 years, and to whom I owe before all of you the plain truth at last, which is the one coin I have ever known her to refuse. He set the glass down untasted. "You have spent 10 years wondering at my silence," he said, "and putting names to it. Pride, some of you. Madness, a good many. Worse than either, a few. I will tell you now what it truly was. 10 years ago, in a room not unlike this one, an honest man was torn to pieces for a thing another man had done. His name was Manor. For 30 years he kept the books of great families, this house among them, and never cheated a soul of a farthing. A fortune vanished upon a forged deed. It was made to seem his hand had forged it, and he was broken, and died of the breaking. I knew he was innocent, and I knew who was not. I was 25, and I stood up in a room much like this one, and said aloud what I knew, with nothing under me but my own word, and you laughed at me. More than one face I can see at this table was laughing then. You took my speaking and drove it like another nail into that innocent man's coffin, and I learned in that hour that a truth with no weight beneath it does more harm than none at all. So I stopped. And for 10 years, in the silence you were so certain was madness, I have been building the weight I lacked." He reached inside his coat and brought out a packet of papers and held it up where all could see, and the room went so still the crackle of the fire was the loudest thing in it. "The man who drew that false deed," he went on, "and carried off the fortune, and stood by while an innocent man was buried alive beneath it, and who then died 6 years ago in his own bed with every honor this county could heap on him, was Sir Cassian Ashcroft, and I can prove it. It is here in my hand. His own true accounts that tell a very different tale from the ones he showed the world, a record from his bank he was sure had long since burned, and a letter in his own unmistakable hand to the man he hired to counterfeit Manor's writing. I have held all of it 2 years and left it in a locked drawer, for the man was dead, and I have never found sport in ruining the dead. And I told myself that dragging it back into the light would cost his daughter more grief than it could hand her back. I was wrong. I have been taught this winter by a soul far braver than my own, that there is one thing worse in this world than a truth that draws blood. It is a truth a man chokes down to keep himself comfortable, and dresses up in the borrowed clothes of mercy, and peace, and respect for the dead. I have worn those clothes over my cowardice 10 years. I take them off tonight." His eyes went at the last to the woman in gray silk, sitting rigid beside the ring of keys. "You will not stop me with what you hold," he said more quietly, so that only the nearer half of the room caught it, though every soul there felt the cold. "You have kept me 10 years with letters that would shame my dead wife, and I have paid your price, my house, my keys, my silence, to keep her quiet in her grave. I will pay it no more. There was nothing shameful in her death, only my own absence from it, which is my shame and not hers, and I would sooner own that shame before all the world than let you use her name 1 hour longer to keep an honest man buried under a lie. You have nothing left to hold over me. I have taken it back." A hush came down then over the long, bright rooms of Cottermere, the sort that presses harder than any uproar. Alone in the middle of it sat Lady Ashcroft, the pleasant smile gone from her face at last, the ring of keys lying by her plate where the Duchess had set it, and one by one every face at that table turned toward her. Her whole life had been built upon a dead man's shining name, and a thing kept deep in the ground, and in a few sentences the name was blackened, and the thing lay dug up in a duke's hand before every person whose good opinion she had ever courted. No soft sigh would cover it, and no turned shoulder would carry it away. She looked, just then, like the mistress of nothing, only like the thing she had been all along beneath the silk. A frightened woman who had guarded a grave 30 years and just watched it broken open in broad day. She said nothing, for there was nothing to say. She rose, took up what little dignity was left her, and walked out through a crowd that parted to let her pass, and not one soul went with her. The clearing of her father's name was done that spring, quietly, by the proper forms and in the proper rooms, with the true papers set at last before men who now had no honest choice but to read them. It took lawyers, and it took time, and it took the whole weight of a duke set behind it, but at the end of it there was a document couched in the flat, unhurried language that such documents keep declaring that Mr. Manor of Aldous Street had been wrongly accused, that he stood acquitted of every charge laid against him, and that his good name was given back to him and to those who came after him. Linnet held the paper in both her hands in the south library, in the first gray light with the Duke standing at her shoulder. And she read the dry words that handed her back the thing which had been stripped from her and from her father before her. And then she wept. She had schooled herself, across 2 hard years, to do without weeping, and had kept the last of that skill by her, against the worst that might come. She had not thought to spend it upon the best, but the tears came now, and she let them come, and the Duke wrote her no slip of paper this time, and for once did not hide inside his silence. He put his arm about her, and let her cry herself out and said not a word, because there was nothing that wanted saying, and it was the fullest and gentlest quiet of all that quiet winter. He never lived to see this day, she said when she could speak again. That is the grief at the bottom of it all. You have handed me back his name, and he is not here to be handed it. He went to his grave believing himself a failure, believing his careful, honest years had come to nothing, and that he had left his girl with a ruined name, and not a friend in the world. He did not go to his grave believing he had no one, said the Duke. It was the first she had heard of it. He was quiet a moment, choosing the words in the slow, careful way he always chose them. I went to him, he said, near the very end. I could not clear him, for I had no proof yet, and my word by then was reckoned worth nothing, as the whole county had lately taught me. But I went to him all the same, a young man he barely knew, with nothing in my hands to give, and told him that I knew past all doubting he was innocent, that I believed him entire, and that I would not rest while I lived until the world was made to believe him too. My word was the only thing I had, and I knew already the poor price the world set on it. I gave it to him anyway, and he took it. He died knowing, Linnet, that one living person believed in him. It did not save him nor give him back his name, nor his life, but he did not go down into the dark supposing himself believed by no one, and that much I saw to. Those few words to your father were the last I spoke aloud, and meant to any living creature, until the morning you walked into this house. And Linnet saw then the whole shape of him at last, the 10 locked years with the spoken truth at either end. The first murmured to a dying man in a sick room, and the last flung down before the people who had helped to break him, the long, dark quiet between them broken open, in the end, by a penniless woman who had come to his door with nothing. There remained one thing she did not understand, and she asked it, later, when the worst of the weeping was done. Why the South Library? Why that room, and that one key, given her in secret, before he knew her at all? He was a long time answering. It was Amabel's room, he said at last. Her books are the ones upon those shelves. It was locked the day she died, and I did not go into it again in 10 years, nor let another soul in, And I could not have told you, that first week, why I unlocked it for a stranger and gave her the only key. I have thought about it a great deal since. I think some part of me, wiser than the rest, knew before I would let myself know it, what you were going to become to me. I gave you the one room in this house I could give to no one, and told myself it meant nothing, the way I told myself many things meant nothing that winter. She had no answer for that either, and did not try to find one, and only reached up and laid her hand against his hard cheek, which she had never done before, and he let her. He offered her, that same spring, the thing she had never once thought to be offered, her freedom. The name was cleared, he said. The settlement was hers, absolutely. The doors of the county stood open to her again, and she owed him nothing, less than nothing. If she wished to go and make a life wholly her own, with no debt to any soul and no cold marriage to bind her, he would see her safely gone and never trouble her again. He made her see he meant it. He had come to loathe the thought of keeping anything given only out of need, or gratitude, or the want of anywhere else to go, and would not keep her on those terms, for they were the terms he had married her on, and he was ashamed of them now. He would sooner set her free and lose her clean, than hold her by an obligation. So he told her she was free, and then asked her, straight out, in that rough relearned voice, whether, being wholly free and owing him nothing, she would stay, not to discharge a debt. Not because she had no choice, only if she wished to. And Linnet, who had come north to Cottermere with all she owned packed into one small trunk and no future in front of her at all, stood now in the room that had been one woman's long grief and had somehow become her own quiet gladness, and she made a choice that belonged wholly and only to herself, freely, in no need and no fear, lacking nothing that she did not already hold. "I kept every slip of paper you ever wrote me," she said, folded in my dressing-table drawer, a whole winter of them, and I could never have told you why, though I think some part of me understood long before the rest of me would own to it. "Yes, I will stay, and I will make you talk, though I had better warn you that I have grown as fond of your silences as you are, and I mean for us to keep our full share of them." She was quiet a moment. "You have given me back my father's name. But you gave me a better thing than the name, long before and without a word. The very first night, when you saw that a stranger you owed nothing had a fire in her room and a warm stone for her feet before ever she arrived to need it. You gave me back the belief that a kind act might be only itself a kindness and nothing more, with no reckoning hidden inside it. I had lost hold of that, and of all the bad years took from me, it was the loss I felt the worst, worse even than the name, and you gave it back before you knew me at all, before it could be anything on earth but what it was. That is the man I am choosing tonight. Not only the one who stood up in a bright crowded room and shattered 10 years of silence for my sake, though I love him too, and dearly, but the one who, long before any of it, and telling no one, saw to it that a frozen stranger came home to a lit fire. In the long good years that followed, they kept one habit that no one outside the story could ever have made sense of. Every morning, in the first gray light, the Duke and Duchess of Aldermore went down together to the estate room and sat side by side as the light came up, and for a while said nothing at all. It was not the old silence any longer, the shut and bolted silence of the 10 bad years, but a different kind, the kind that settles on two people who have said aloud all the great things and no longer need to say them twice, and who find they can sit in the quiet afterward and want for nothing. He did speak, in those good years carefully, his voice keeping always a little of its roughness, for a voice 10 years shut away never wholly loses the mark of the shutting. The same county that had once named his silence madness came to prize his few dry sentences above whole hours of another man's talk, for people set the highest value upon a thing only once they have been taught that it can be taken from them. He took his place at the head of his own table, and kept it. He sat there the night the physician came to tell them their first child was safely born, a daughter, and he went nowhere at all, but stayed in the house the whole of that long night, and heard the child cry, and was there. He had learned the one lesson of the 10 years worth the keeping, which was where a man must be, and when, and that some things cannot be done in silence from a back room. The keys hung at Lynette's own waist from that spring to the end of her life, iron and brass on a chain of worn steel, and the house answered to her, and the servants came to know the sound of them approaching down a passage. But she never once took up the great ring without a private thought of the night it had lain beside her own plate at a bright table, and of the toast that had turned, between one breath and the next, from a surrender into a reckoning. On the wall of the South Library, among Amabel's books that were her books now, she hung the first thing he had ever written her, the little note in the lean, upright hand, and beside it, upon its faded ribbon, the single black key. No one who did not know the whole story could have said why the Duchess of Aldermore kept a plain scrap of paper and a common iron key framed upon her wall. But Lynette knew why. Every respectable door in London had been shut in her face once, in the bitterest winter of her life, and by the one measure the world keeps, every one had been right to shut. And one silent man had said not a word, but simply unlocked a door of his own, and put the one key to it into her hand, and asked her for nothing. That worn key and that framed scrap were, when all the rest was told, the truest measure of her whole happiness. And the strangest part, the part not one of those guests could ever have understood, was that the whole of it had begun in silence, and had needed no word at all to begin.